If you're listening to this, it means I'm no longer among the living. I'm recording this on an old voice recorder I found in my apartment desk drawer, hoping someone will discover this story and understand the truth about what was happening at the Metropolitan Historical Museum. My death is inevitable. I've known it for days, ever since they started hounding me even at home. The dark forces that dwell in those ancient halls don't release their victims. But while I'm still alive, while my fingers can press the buttons on this device, I have to tell you about the nightmare that became my life from the moment I took the job as a night security guard. My name is Arthur Miller. I'm 42 years old, and until recently I considered myself an ordinary man with rather mundane problems. A divorce from my wife a year and a half ago left me with crippling mortgage debt and alimony payments that ate up most of my salary as a programmer at a small tech company. After I was laid off due to staff optimization, I searched for work for months, but the market was saturated with specialists in my field, and my age was working against me. My savings dwindled daily, and I knew I'd soon be unable to even pay for the one-bedroom apartment I was renting on the outskirts of Brighton City, where I'd moved after the divorce. I found the night security guard position at the museum quite by chance. Browse listings on a job search website. The terms were more than appealing. A decent salary, official employment, and most importantly, they were willing to hire someone without prior security experience. The only requirements were a high school diploma and a clean record. The work schedule also seemed not particularly burdensome. 4 nights a week from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. The rest of the time I could focus on finding a primary job in my field. The Metropolitan Historical Museum was located downtown in a 19th century building that was itself a historical landmark. The 3-story red brick structure with tall pointed windows and massive oak doors made an imposing impression even during the day. And at dusk, it took on a grim, almost sinister appearance. When I first approached the main entrance for my interview, I was struck by the silence that surrounded the building, despite the museum being just 2 blocks from the main city square. The museum director, Eleanor Morrison, a woman in her mid-50s with graying hair pulled back in a strict bun, met me in her office on the 2nd floor. The office was furnished with antique furniture and lined with books, and the walls were adorned with portraits of people in old-fashioned clothes, likely previous directors or prominent figures in local history. The interview went surprisingly quickly and formally. Eleanor asked a few standard questions about my education and reasons for seeking work, but I noticed she seemed anxious and kept glancing at her watch as if in a hurry to end the conversation. What surprised me most was that she showed almost no interest in my experience or abilities. Instead, she emphasized several times that a security guard's job at the museum required strong nerves and the ability to not panic in unusual situations. When I asked what she meant, Eleanor hesitated and said something vague about old buildings sometimes having a life of their own. Creaking floorboards, doors slamming due to drafts, alarm sensors triggering for no apparent reason. She assured me that nothing truly dangerous ever happened at the museum, but working alone at night could affect the psyche of impressionable people. The next day, I was already signing the employment contract and receiving keys to the museum, as well as instructions on how to operate the security system. The system was quite modern. Motion sensors in every hall, surveillance cameras, and a panic button connected to a private security firm's central station. I was told my primary task was to make rounds of all the halls every 2 hours, checking that all exhibits were in place and nothing suspicious had occurred. The rest of the time I could spend in the guards' room on the 1st floor, which had a small desk, an armchair, a kettle, and even a TV. The first few nights passed calmly and even pleasantly. I finally felt some relief that I had a stable income again, even if temporary. At night, the museum was plunged into absolute silence, broken only by the hum of refrigerators in the utility rooms and the rare sound of cars from the street. The halls, lit only by emergency lights, took on a special atmosphere. The exhibits seemed more mysterious and significant than in bright daylight. The museum specialized in local history and archaeology. The first floor housed exhibits from the city's founding and the development of trade in the region. Ancient coins, documents, everyday objects of merchants and artisans. The second floor was dedicated to the area's more ancient history, displaying archaeological finds including several sculptures and tombstones unearthed from old burial grounds. The third floor held an ethnographic collection, folk costumes, religious artifacts, old icons. What impressed me most was the Hall of Antiquities on the second floor, where fragments of ancient sculptures and statues were displayed, some of which were quite well preserved. Particularly striking was a marble head of a young man with curly hair, the work of an unknown master, presumably from the 3rd century CE. Next to it stood the torso of a female figure without a head or arms, and in the corner of the hall there was an almost complete statue of an old man in a toga with a serious, stern face. It was in this hall that I first felt something strange. It happened on my 4th night of work, when I was doing another round around 3 in the morning. Passing by the display cases with the ancient exhibits, I suddenly felt like someone was watching me. It was a physically tangible feeling, the same kind you get when someone is looking at your back on public transport or on the street. I turned around, but there was no one in the hall, just the same marble fragments and statues in their usual poses. Trying to shake off the unsettling feeling, I continued my rounds, but the sense of being watched didn't leave me. Moreover, it seemed to me that the statue of the old man, which had previously looked straight ahead, had now turned its head towards me. I stopped and looked carefully at the sculpture, trying to recall its exact position, but my memory failed me. In the end, I convinced myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me, caused by fatigue and the unfamiliar surroundings. The next few weeks, I tried to adjust to my new routine and fight off the growing unease my night shifts at the museum caused. I spent my days trying to find a regular job, sending out resumes and attending interviews, but with no success. Employers either found me overqualified for simpler positions or too old for prestigious ones. Gradually, I started to realize that my job as a night security guard might stretch on indefinitely, and that thought didn't exactly fill me with optimism. My sleep schedule became catastrophically disrupted. After a night shift, I'd get home around 7:30 a.m., but falling asleep was far from immediate. The sounds of the waking city, barking dogs, slamming apartment doors, the voices of people rushing to work, seemed unnaturally loud after the silence of the museum halls. When I finally did drift off, I was tormented by strange, unsettling dreams, where marble statues came alive, chasing me through endless corridors, their stone eyes glowing with an unearthly light in the darkness. I usually woke up around 4 in the afternoon feeling broken and with a heavy head, as if I hadn't rested at all. The rest of the day passed in a sluggish, half-awake state. I mechanically prepared food, watched TV without processing what was on, or aimlessly surfed the internet for job openings I didn't have the energy to apply for. By evening, the familiar sense of dread about the upcoming night at the museum would begin to build, and I knew I was trapped in a vicious cycle with no apparent way out. The strange occurrences at the museum began to escalate about a month into my employment. At first, they were minor things that could be ignored or explained away by natural causes. Sometimes I'd find museum placards describing exhibits lying on the floor even though they'd been in place the day before. Periodically, motion sensors would trigger in empty halls, but when I rushed to check, no one would be there. The security firm blamed technical glitches and promised to calibrate the equipment, but the false alarms continued. One night, while making rounds on the second floor, I found the door to the ethnography hall, which I distinctly remembered closing, now wide open. What's more, several glass display cases inside the hall were also open, even though their keys were kept in the director's safe. I thoroughly checked all the exhibits, but nothing was missing. The next morning, reporting the incident to Eleanor Morrison, I noticed she didn't look surprised, but rather troubled. She mumbled something about old building locks sometimes sticking, but I could tell she didn't believe her own explanations. It was then that I first thought about my predecessors. In a month of work, I still hadn't met the guard I replaced, even though logically our shifts should have overlapped. When I asked Eleanor about it, she replied that the previous employee had resigned voluntarily, without waiting for the end of his probationary period. From her tone, I understood that the topic was unpleasant for her, and I decided not to press for details. Curiosity, however, gnawed at me. Rummaging through the desk drawers in the guard's room, I stumbled upon a notebook that, judging by the handwriting, belonged to one of my predecessors. Most of the entries were ordinary work notes, patrol times, instrument readings, observed malfunctions. But on the last pages, the tone of the entries sharply changed. The handwriting became shaky, uneven, and the content disturbing. One of the last entries particularly struck me. They move at night. The statues in the Antiquities Hall change their poses. The old man in the toga is now pointing his hand towards the staircase. I hear footsteps in the empty halls. I should have listened to Gregory and not taken this job. Tomorrow I'm handing in my resignation. The next entry was even more terrifying. I can't resign, they won't let me. I saw a dead man in the weapons hall. He stood by the display case with swords, and when I approached, he vanished. But the smell remained. The smell of grave dirt and decay. The very last entry, dated 3 months earlier, was very brief. They're coming home too. Nowhere to run. After that, the pages were blank. These entries made me look at the events in the museum in a new light. What I had previously tried to explain away as fatigue and imagination possibly had more serious reasons. I decided to keep my own observations and began to record all the oddities I noticed during my night shifts. The first thing I noted was that the statues truly seemed to change their poses. Of course, I couldn't catch them in motion, but the positions of their hands, the turn of a head, the direction of a gaze, all of this subtly shifted from night to night. The statue of the old man in the toga, which originally looked straight ahead, had now definitively turned its head to the left, towards the staircase leading to the 3rd floor. The marble head of the youth, which had previously been slightly tilted downwards, now looked directly at the hall entrance, as if watching everyone who entered. The sounds also became clearer and less explainable. I began to distinguish footsteps in the empty halls overhead. Not random creaks of floorboards, but rhythmic measured sounds as if someone was slowly walking through the corridors of the 3rd floor. When I went up to check, the footsteps would stop, but the air would feel strangely cold and sometimes a faint, elusive smell that reminded me of a mix of old dust, withered flowers, and something else I couldn't quite place. The hall with the ecclesiastical artifacts on the 3rd floor particularly unnerved me. It housed ancient icons, priestly vestments, crosses, and other religious items, some of which had been found when old churches destroyed during the city's urban renewal projects were dismantled. In this hall, I always felt uneasy, as if an invisible presence was watching me with judgment and disapproval. The icons seemed to follow my every move with their eyes darkened by time. One night, around 4 in the morning, I was conducting another round of the 3rd floor and entered the Hall of Church Antiquities. As usual, I felt a tension here, but tonight it was particularly strong. The air seemed thick, viscous, and it became harder to breathe. I hastily examined the display cases, making sure all the exhibits were in place, and was about to leave the hall when I heard a sound that made me freeze in my tracks. It was singing, faint, barely audible but distinctly discernible church chanting in an ancient tongue, perhaps Latin or Old English. The voices were low, male, and contained such sorrow and lamentation that shivers ran down my spine. The singing seemed to come from deep underground or from a very distant past, and echoes of a requiem service could be discerned within it. I stood motionless, afraid to move, until the singing subsided as suddenly as it had begun. The silence after it seemed even more oppressive than before. My hands trembled as I wrote down this incident in my notebook, and my heart pounded so loudly that I feared its beat would echo throughout the museum and awaken what was better left sleeping. From that night on, the nature of what was happening in the museum changed. If before the oddities could be attributed to imagination or the peculiarities of an old building, it now became clear that something inhabited the museum that did not desire the presence of living people at night. The temperature in the halls began to drop significantly at night, even though the heating was working correctly. My breath became visible and my fingers grew numb despite my warm clothes. The exhibits, too, began to behave increasingly strangely. In the archaeology hall, several ancient clay pots were found turned with their openings facing different directions every night, although I clearly remembered their original positions. In the display case with coins, the coins were rearranged in a different order, sometimes forming patterns or symbols whose meaning was unclear to me. But what scared me most were the changes in the antiquities hall. The statues no longer just changed poses. They seemed to interact with each other. The old man in the toga stretched his arm towards the female torso as if trying to touch it. The youth's head was now turned towards the old man, and the expression on the marble face had changed. Something akin to fear or supplication could be read in it. I started taking photographs of the statues every night, hoping to capture the changes, but in the pictures they always looked motionless and ordinary. The camera seemed unable to capture the life that awakened in the marble with the onset of darkness. This made me doubt my own sanity. Perhaps everything that was happening was a figment of my disturbed imagination, a result of chronic sleep deprivation and stress, but my doubts were dispelled one November night when I first saw them. The dead ones my predecessor had written about. It happened around midnight when I was conducting my first round. Ascending to the second floor and heading towards the antiquities hall, I saw a human figure at the end of the corridor. At first, I thought it was a visitor who had somehow remained in the museum after closing, and I hurried towards him, ready to explain that the museum was closed. But the closer I got, the clearer I realized something was wrong with this person. He stood absolutely motionless, his back to me, and was dressed in strange, old-fashioned clothing. A long, dark frock coat and a wide-brimmed hat. When I called out to him, the figure slowly began to turn, and what I saw made me recoil in horror. He had no face. Instead, a dark void gaped, from which emanated the smell of grave dirt and decay. The hands he extended towards me were bony, almost skeletal, and a dark, oily mist seeped from his empty eye sockets. I screamed and bolted, but when I looked back a few seconds later, the corridor was empty. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the guard's room, afraid to go out on patrol. In the morning, I submitted my resignation, but Eleanor Morrison persuaded me to stay, explaining that finding a replacement would be very difficult and promising a raise. I really needed the money, and I agreed to work for another month, hoping to find another job in the meantime. My decision to stay at the museum for another month was the fatal mistake of my life. Now, with my days numbered, I understand that Eleanor Morrison knew far more than she let on. She knew what happened to the night guards. She knew their fate, but she kept hiring new people, condemning them to the same end. Perhaps she simply had no choice. The museum had to be guarded, and the dark forces inhabiting its halls demanded their tribute in human lives. After my encounter with the faceless figure, my mental state rapidly deteriorated. Daytime sleep became almost impossible. As soon as I closed my eyes, I'd see that featureless figure in the dark frock coat, extending its skeletal hands towards me. I started abusing sleeping pills and alcohol, but even that didn't help. Even in a state of heavy intoxication, my consciousness refused to completely shut down, as if some invisible force kept me in a state of constant vigilance, preventing me from finding peace neither day nor night. My appetite vanished completely. Food tasted bland, and sometimes I'd get a repulsive taste of dirt and decay in my mouth that wouldn't go away even after thorough brushing. I rapidly lost weight. My face took on an unhealthy yellowish tint, and my eyes were bloodshot from constant sleep deprivation. Neighbors started avoiding me in the hallway, and some even crossed to the other side of the street when they saw me. I knew I looked frightening, but there was nothing I could do about it. Working at the museum became a true nightmare. The dead ones now appeared every night, becoming increasingly active and aggressive. At first, they were solitary figures who simply stood in the corridors or halls, observing me with their empty eye sockets. Then there were more of them. Sometimes I'd see 2 or 3 specters at once, and they began to move, slowly pursuing me through the museum halls. They were all dressed in clothing from different eras. Medieval monks in coarse robes, 18th century aristocrats in waistcoats and wigs, 19th century merchants in frock coats, women in long, dark dresses with high collars. They shared one thing: the absence of faces and that horrifying smell of decomposition which grew stronger with each passing night. They made no sounds, but their presence was physically palpable. The air around them became thick and cold, and metallic objects in their presence became covered in frost. The statues in the Antiquities Hall also changed dramatically. Now they moved not only at night, but also when I wasn't looking at them. I could walk into the hall and find the old man in the toga in a completely new pose, with an arm raised as if he were greeting someone or leaning forward as if listening to a whisper. The headless, armless female torso would sometimes turn towards me, and I felt invisible eyes intently studying me. The head of the curly-haired youth periodically changed its expression. Sometimes a smile, more sinister than friendly, would be frozen on the marble face. The most terrifying thing was that the statues began to make sounds. At first it was a barely audible creak, which I attributed to the natural sounds of an old building. But gradually the sounds became clearer. I heard the rustle of fabric when the statues changed poses, the clinking of marble against marble as they moved their arms or heads, and even something akin to breathing. Deep, slow, unnatural. One night, around 2 a.m, I heard a voice. It was the statue of the old man in the toga. His lips didn't move, but I distinctly heard a low, raspy whisper that seemed to emanate from deep within the marble. He spoke words in Latin, which I didn't understand, but the intonation was both threatening and solemn. When I approached, trying to make out the words, the old man suddenly fell silent and turned his head towards me. His stone eyes glowed with a dull, reddish light, and I distinctly saw something alive, intelligent, and infinitely evil within them. Other museum exhibits also began to show signs of supernatural activity. In the medieval weapons hall, swords and spears independently changed positions, and sometimes I heard the clang of metal, as if invisible warriors were fighting in the empty hall. In the ethnographic department, folk costumes rustled as if worn by the ghosts of long-dead people, and ancient musical instruments played quiet, mournful melodies without human touch. The Hall of Church Antiquities became particularly active. The icons no longer just followed me with their gaze. Their faces expressed various emotions from compassion to wrath. Sometimes I saw dark, almost black tears flowing from the eyes of the saints in the icons, leaving stains on the wooden surface. The church chanting I had first heard a month ago now sounded almost every night, growing louder and clearer. In it, I began to discern not only requiem prayers, but something else, threatening, cursing intonations, as if the voices of the dead were calling down divine punishment upon me for some unknown sins. But what was truly horrifying were the changes that began to happen to me personally. At first I noticed that my reflection in mirrors became strange. Sometimes it seemed to lag behind my movements by a fraction of a second, and sometimes my mirror double-made gestures I didn't make. Then I discovered strange marks on my body, dark spots and streaks that appeared in the mornings and disappeared by evening. They didn't hurt or itch, but they looked like bruises or burns. My memory also began to fail me. I forgot simple things, where I left my keys, whether I turned off the gas, if I locked the door. Sometimes I found myself standing in the middle of a room and couldn't remember why I had gone there. Several times I woke up not in my bed but on the floor or in an armchair, not remembering how I got there. This frightened me most of all. I was afraid I was losing my mind, and that thought was almost unbearable. About 3 weeks after encountering the first dead one, an event occurred that finally convinced me that the dark forces of the museum were not limited to its walls. I returned home after an especially difficult night, during which I had seen 5 ghosts at once and heard the voices of the statues almost incessantly. As soon as I crossed the threshold of my apartment, I felt that something was wrong. The air in the apartment was cold, despite the working heaters, and it smelled of the same grave dirt I had grown accustomed to in the museum. In the corner of the living room where my armchair usually stood now loomed a familiar figure, the statue of the old man in the toga from the museum's antiquities hall. He stood absolutely motionless, but his marble eyes followed my every move. When I approached, the statue slowly turned its head and spoke the same Latin words I had heard in the museum. I rushed to the exit, but the door wouldn't open. The lock seemed jammed. Turning back, I saw that the old man had vanished, but the smell remained, and on the floor where the statue had stood there were traces of marble dust. I spent the rest of the day in a nearby coffee shop, afraid to return home. But by evening I realized there was nowhere to go. I still had to work, and the apartment was the only place I could even try to rest. From that day on, the ghosts and statues began to haunt me, not only in the museum but also at home. Sometimes, waking up in the middle of the night, I saw dark figures in the corner of the room that vanished as soon as I looked at them. My neighbors started complaining about strange sounds coming from my apartment, creaking, thudding, and sometimes voices, even though I lived alone. The building manager came up to me several times with complaints, but seeing my condition, she limited herself to stern warnings. I understood that what was happening was beyond human comprehension. These were not hallucinations of a sick mind. Too many details pointed to the reality of the events. The dust from the statues that remained on the floor, the temperature changes recorded by the thermometer, the neighbors' complaints about sounds. All of this indicated that supernatural forces had indeed invaded my life and no longer intended to let me go. I tried to find information about the museum's history and the circumstances of previous guards' deaths or disappearances, but I ran into a strange wall of silence. There was no mention of incidents at the museum in local newspapers, and official documents about personnel changes were unavailable. When I tried to find out the fate of the person whose notes I found in the desk, I was told he had left town immediately after resigning and left no contact information. The only lead was an old museum janitor named Greg, whom my predecessor had mentioned in his notes. Greg had worked at the museum for over 20 years but never pulled night shifts. I found him in the city park where he was working as a gardener and tried to talk to him about the museum. At first, he brushed me off, claiming he didn't know anything special about the building, but when I told him what I had seen on my night shifts, his face turned pale. Greg looked around, made sure no one was listening, and quietly said, "I told Peter not to take that job. I told him. Evil spirits run rampant there at night. But he didn't listen. He needed the money." When I asked what happened to Peter, Greg was silent for a long time and then slowly said, "They found him a month after he quit, in the woods about 10 miles outside of town. They said his heart gave out, but I saw him shortly before he died. He was a shadow, barely standing, and in his eyes was such terror, as if he'd seen something a human shouldn't see." This information finally convinced me that I needed to resign immediately, and perhaps even leave the city. But when I tried to submit my resignation for a second time, something strange happened. Eleanor Morrison listened to me silently and then said I would have to work for another 2 weeks until a replacement could be found. When I objected that, according to labor laws, I had the right to resign at any time, her eyes gleamed strangely and she whispered, "You can't leave, Arthur. They won't let you." At that moment, I didn't understand the meaning of her words, but that evening, as I was getting ready for work, I discovered that I couldn't leave my apartment. The door would open, but as soon as I took a step across the threshold, such a weakness would overcome me that my legs refused to hold me. My head would spin, my heart pounded so hard I feared losing consciousness. When I returned to the apartment, the unpleasant sensations instantly disappeared. Several times I tried to force myself to overcome this state, but each attempt was unsuccessful. Moreover, if I stood on the threshold for too long, the same strange things that happened in the museum would begin to occur in my apartment. Ghosts would appear, voices would be heard, the temperature would drop. It became clear that the dark forces truly did not intend to let me go and were prepared to pursue me wherever I went. Then I tried to seek help from the priest of the local church, Father Michael, an elderly man with kind eyes and a gray beard. After listening to my story, he remained silent for a long time, and then said that he agreed to help, but warned that fighting such forces required great faith and could be dangerous for everyone involved. We agreed that he would come with me to the museum the following night and attempt to perform an exorcism. The last night of my life began deceptively calmly. Father Michael arrived at the museum at 11:30 carrying a travel bag with holy water, a crucifix, and church books. Despite his 70 years, he looked resolute, almost warlike. His presence filled me with confidence. For the first time in many weeks, I felt I wasn't alone against the dark forces that had turned my life into hell. We started in the guards' room where Father Michael sprinkled holy water in all corners and recited a prayer of protection. Then he took out an ancient church book with a worn leather binding and explained that it was a collection of prayers against evil forces used by his grandfather and great-grandfather, who had served in these very lands. In the dim light of the desk lamp, the pages of the book appeared yellowed with age, and the archaic script looked almost mystical. The first hour passed peacefully. We toured the first floor, and Father Michael read prayers in each hall, sprinkling the display cases and exhibits with holy water. The museum seemed to quiet, as if the dark forces were biding their time, studying their new opponent. Even the familiar cold I felt every night became less noticeable. I began to hope that the priest's presence could truly change things, but when we ascended to the second floor and headed towards the antiquities hall, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The temperature plummeted so sharply that our breath became visible, and paint began to peel from the walls in thin flakes, falling to the floor like snow. Father Michael stopped at the entrance to the hall, and I saw his face turn pale. He whispered a short prayer and stepped resolutely inside. The statues greeted us in entirely new poses. The old man in the toga now stood in the center of the hall, his right arm raised in a gesture of damnation. The headless, armless female torso had somehow moved closer to the entrance, as if blocking our path of retreat. The curly-haired youth's head now lay on the floor, its marble eyes glowing with the same reddish light I had seen before. Father Michael began to read an exorcism prayer, his voice steady and confident despite the nightmare surrounding us. But as soon as he uttered the first words, the statues began to move, not slowly and subtly as before, but sharply, jerkily, like puppets controlled by a mad puppeteer. The old man in the toga turned to face us, and his mouth opened, emitting a sound that couldn't be called human. It was the howl of wind in an empty tomb, the moan of a dying man, the shriek of an owl at midnight. The holy water in the priest's hands began to boil and evaporate, filling the air with acrid steam. The pages of the ancient book burst into blue flame, but Father Michael continued to recite the prayers from memory, even as the book turned to ash in his hands. His voice trembled but didn't falter, and I saw the statues shudder with every word he uttered. Suddenly, the dead ones appeared in the hall, not one or two as usual, but an entire crowd. They materialized from the air like a dense fog, condensing and taking human form. There were so many of them that the hall transformed into a graveyard, populated by animated corpses from all eras. Medieval knights in rust-eaten armor stood beside monks in decayed robes, 19th-century merchants in frock coats next to peasants in homespun clothes. All of them shared the absence of faces and that unbearable smell of decomposition which was now so strong I could barely breathe. The dead ones began to approach us slowly, extending skeletal hands and emitting chilling moans. Father Michael raised his crucifix and pointed it at the ghostly throng continuing to read prayers. For a moment the dead ones paused as if encountering an invisible barrier. But then their moans turned into a deafening roar and they resumed their advance. It was then that I knew we were doomed. The forces inhabiting the museum were too ancient and powerful for one priest, no matter how righteous and experienced, to cast out. These spirits had been feeding on the energy of living people for centuries, and each fallen guard only strengthened their power. We had fallen into a trap from which there was no escape. The statue of the old man suddenly took a step forward, and the floor beneath its feet cracked as if the marble weighed tons, not hundreds of pounds. It spoke, and this time I understood the words. It spoke in an ancient tongue, like those used in old incantations. The living must not disturb the peace of the dead. The living must become the dead to serve us in eternity. Father Michael recoiled, his face wet with sweat despite the cold in the hall. The crucifix in his hands began to blacken as if touched by invisible fire. He whispered to me, "Run, my son. Run while you still can. I will hold them off as long as I can." But I knew running was futile. They would find me anywhere, and besides, I couldn't leave the old man alone in this hell. The dead ones surrounded us in a tight circle, their empty eye sockets radiating a cold light, and a black liquid oozed from their decomposing mouths, hissing as it hit the floor. One of them, a knight in a rusted helmet, reached out and touched Father Michael's shoulder. The priest cried out in pain, and I saw his hair instantly turn white, and his face became covered with deep wrinkles as if he had aged 20 years in a few seconds. I lunged at the specter, trying to push him away from the priest, but my hand passed through its body as if through an icy mist. However, my touch did not go unnoticed. The knight turned to me, and beneath the visor of his helmet I saw not a face but a bottomless void, from which emanated such a cold that my lungs constricted with pain. He grabbed my throat with a skeletal hand, and I felt life begin to drain from my body. But at that moment, something unexpected happened. Father Michael, gathering his last strength, uttered words of a prayer I had never heard before. An ancient, powerful prayer that made all the dead ones recoil. His voice no longer sounded like that of an old man, but like a peal of thunder, filling the entire hall with divine power. For a moment the specters retreated, their outlines becoming less distinct, and I was able to free myself from the knight's grip, but it was only a temporary reprieve. Strength left Father Michael with every second, and I saw him literally fading before my eyes, giving his life energy in the fight against the dark forces. His gray beard turned pure white, his hands trembled with exhaustion, and his eyes lost their former sparkle. He whispered to me, "They are too strong. Forgive me, my son. I could not save you." The dead ones began their advance again, and this time there were even more of them. New specters materialized from the walls, floor, and ceiling. Victims who had perished in this building over centuries of its existence. Among them I saw the faces of people in modern clothing. They were my predecessors, the guards who, like me, had fallen into the trap of the museum's spirits. Their faces expressed endless sorrow and despair, and I realized that after death they found no peace but were turned into slaves of the ancient forces that killed them. One of the ghosts in a guard's uniform approached me closer than the others, and I recognized him as the man whose notes I found in the desk, Peter. His mouth moved silently, and it seemed he was trying to warn me of something or apologize for not being able to prevent my fate. But then his face contorted with the same malice as the other dead ones, and he reached out for me. Father Michael fell to his knees, his prayers turning into a barely audible whisper. The crucifix in his hands crumbled to dust, and I knew the end was near. The statues in the hall became fully animated. The old man in the toga strode towards us, leaving deep cracks in the floor. The female torso somehow levitated in the air, and the youth's head rolled across the floor, making a horrifying scraping sound of marble on stone. The dead ones grabbed my arms and legs, their touches burning with a cold that penetrated to my very bones. I felt my life force begin to drain into them, how my warmth was absorbed by their icy bodies. The priest tried to rise to help me, but several specters surrounded him, and his cries of pain echoed through the hall. In the last moments of my consciousness, I saw the statue of the old man lean over me and speak words that etched themselves into my memory forever. Now you are one of us. Your soul will serve us, and your body will become bait for the next. It has always been so. It will be forever. His stone lips stretched into a smile that held nothing human, only the cold joy of a predator who had caught its prey. The last thing I remember from my human life is my heart stopping, and then starting to beat again, but no longer with the life I was given at birth. It was a different life, cold, hungry, full of hatred for everything living and warm. I had become one of them, one of the dead ones who inhabit the museum at night and wait for new victims. Father Michael was found in the Antiquities Hall the next morning. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack, although witnesses said his body looked as if he had died a month ago, not just yesterday. He was buried 3 days later, and I was at that funeral, not as a living person, but as a specter, watching from the shadows as the one who tried to save me was laid to rest. My own disappearance was explained by the assumption that I couldn't bear the horror of the priest's death and fled the city. The search continued for 2 weeks, and then the case was closed. A month later, a new night security guard was hired at the museum, a young man named Andrew, who needed money for university tuition. I watched him sign the employment contract just as Eleanor Morrison gave him the same instructions she had once given me. Now I know the truth about the museum director. She is not human, at least not entirely. Many years ago, she too was a victim of the museum's spirits, but death did not free her. It turned her into a conduit for their will among the living. Her task is to find new guards who will become sustenance for the ancient forces dwelling within the building. She suffers no less than we do, but she cannot resist her nature, just as a predator cannot abandon the hunt. Every night I emerge from oblivion and roam the museum halls with the other dead ones. We wait for the new guard to make another round, to feed on his fear, his life energy, his slowly fading hope of salvation. I see young Andrew making all the same mistakes I did, first trying to explain the oddities rationally, then beginning to panic, then seeking help, and finally realizing he is doomed. Sometimes I try to warn him, appearing in a less terrifying form than the other specters, trying to signal with gestures that he needs to run. But the ancient forces do not allow me to break the established order. When I try to help a living person, pain engulfs my entire spectral essence, and I am forced to retreat. I am making this recording on one of the rare nights when the spirits allow me to retain the remnants of my human consciousness. Tomorrow they will turn me back into a mindless monster, craving others' blood and suffering. But today, I still remember who I once was, and I can warn those who hear this story. Do not seek employment as a night security guard at the Metropolitan Historical Museum. Do not believe promises of good pay and easy working conditions. Within those walls dwells an evil older than our civilization, and it is always hungry. Anyone who crosses the museum's threshold after dark risks not only their life but their soul. And if you still choose not to heed my warnings and take a job there, know that sooner or later I will come for you. Not because I wish to harm you, but because I can no longer resist what they have turned me into. And when you see my spectral figure in the museum corridors, do not try to run. It will only prolong your suffering. Accept your fate with dignity, as I could not. The recorder is running out of power, and my last human thoughts dissolve into the eternal darkness of the museum halls. If someone finds this recording, remember, the one who made it no longer exists among the living. Arthur Miller died that December night along with Father Michael. What remains of him is no longer a man, but merely an echo of a past life, condemned to serve the forces of darkness until the end of time. Beware the Metropolitan Historical Museum. Beware those who offer you work there. And if you ever find yourself near that building late at night, walk past without looking back. The dead should not disturb the living, but sometimes the living themselves come to the dead, and then the boundary between the two worlds is erased forever.